Hark and attend. The matter before us concerns the year 44 BCE and the assassination of Gaius Julius Caesar, the truly comical postscript to this affair. However, was what the assassins did next, which was, to be precise, absolutely nothing. The noble senators of the Republic, having committed the most audacious act of political violence in a generation, simply put down their daggers and, as if the day's work were done, went home for supper, went home to sleep. By the parlance of our own age, one might diagnose them with a rather breathtaking case of overconfidence. Their strategic inertia, however, created a power vacuum, and into this vacuum stepped the very man they had presumed would be neutralized, Mark Antony. Antony, you see, had initially fled Rome in the most undignified fashion, disguised as a common slave with his face smeared in aloe, a hasty exit. Yet, upon glancing over his shoulder, he discovered a distinct lack of pursuit. Not a single shadow stirred, not one assassin was on his tail, and so our man Antony watched. He waited, and after several days of careful observation, a clarifying thought dawned upon him. The Senate, his pursuers, were simply not of a serious caliber. And so he washed the aloe from his face. He strode, with a renewed swagger, back into the heart of Rome. He gathered to him all of Caesar's old guard, the loyalists, the veterans, and then he sat down to negotiate with the very men who had held the bloody knives. The result of this negotiation, brokered by the great orator Cicero, was a masterpiece of political theater. Antony would remain in his post as consul, and Caesar, the man they had murdered, would be granted a full state funeral. The implicit agreement was this: yes, we may have stabbed Caesar to death, but for the sake of public order, we shall pretend he died of natural causes. The funeral, therefore, must be magnificent. Furthermore, it would be publicly declared that the life of Comrade Caesar was glorious and great, and that all must carry forth the revolutionary spirit of his legacy. A splendid fiction. At the same time, Antony and the Senate swore a solemn oath, granting a full and unconditional amnesty to every conspirator involved in Caesar's death. But what the conspirators could never have anticipated, in their fatal lack of foresight, was the content of Caesar's last will and testament. For in this document, Caesar had not only bequeathed his private gardens for the enjoyment of all Roman citizens, but he had also directed that a quarter of his vast fortune be distributed amongst the city's poorest souls. And as Antony read this will aloud to the public, he produced, with the timing of a master showman, the very toga Caesar had been wearing on the day of his death. It was a ruin, a garment riddled with holes and stained with the unmistakable patterns of his blood, a ghastly, pitiable sight. Antony had sworn to grant them amnesty. Yes, but he had made no promises about refraining from a bit of public incitement. He had never sworn he would not nudge the mob into doing his dirty work for him. And the mob, seeing that blood-soaked toga, remembering Caesar's generosity, was overcome with a wave of furious grief, an all-consuming hatred for the senators. That very night, riots erupted across Rome. The targets were, without exception, the Republican senators who had hailed themselves as liberators. These so-called liberators could do nothing but flee for their lives, scrambling out of Rome to escape the political firestorm they themselves had ignited. Among them, of course, was Brutus. That Brutus fled to the northeast of the Balkan Peninsula. Antony had successfully purged his rivals from the city, but he could not himself become Caesar's successor. Why? Because of the will, the very document he had used as a weapon. For that will, read aloud before all of Rome, stipulated with unambiguous clarity that the heir to Caesar's name and fortune was neither his son with the Egyptian queen, Caesarion, nor his loyal lieutenant Antony. No, the heir was a young man of only 19 years, a name that would echo through history as the founder of the Roman Empire. Gaius Octavius. Now, who was this Octavius in terms of blood? He was Caesar's grandnephew. His mother was Caesar's niece, but in Caesar's will, he was granted another. Far more potent identity. He was Caesar's adopted son. To retroactively make one's grandnephew into one's son would be a genealogical scandal in many cultures. But in ancient Rome, where an uncle might marry his own niece, the logic was perfectly sound. To adopt the child of that niece as one's own son was a small, almost trivial next step. Octavius, known to us now as Octavian, had been raised in Caesar's household as his ward, and one must understand a crucial point about Roman custom. When you are adopted, you take the family name. Thus his name became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He would carry that name to the very pinnacle of his power, never reverting to his birth name. For the sake of clarity in this chronicle, however, we shall follow convention and refer to him by his most common designation, Octavian. When Caesar died, Octavian was with the Roman legions preparing for a campaign in Parthia. Upon learning that he, a mere boy, was the designated heir, he moved with astonishing speed and returned to Rome, and what followed proves that Caesar's eye for talent was truly unparalleled. Octavian possessed little of Caesar's military genius. He lacked that decisive, commanding aura, but his political instincts were nothing short of supernatural. When he arrived in Rome, Antony was already master of the situation. Octavian was 19 years old, a boy. He held no office. He wielded no formal power in the Roman political machine. His only asset was the legal, legitimate inheritance of Caesar's name and immense fortune. And so, what did the young man do? His first move was a tour of calculated conversations. He sought out his late father's old lieutenants, the seasoned veterans and powerful men, and in every conversation, he would invoke the name of his deified adoptive father. He would begin, "As my father Caesar used to say," or "I know how much my father respected you, General." He played the part of the dutiful, grieving son to perfection. His next move was pure flattery. "My dear senator," he would say to some powerful elder, "I hold you in such high esteem. Should I ever hold power, you would be my most trusted advisor." This campaign of soft power, this relentless and savvy networking, naturally began to irritate Mark Antony. The older man saw a rival emerging and responded with petty obstruction. He even refused to give Octavian the keys to Caesar's treasury, but Antony did not understand. This was precisely the outcome Octavian wanted, playing the part of the wronged orphan. Octavian took money from his own family's coffers and began to distribute it to the poor of Rome, fulfilling the terms of the will that Antony was obstructing. And as he handed out the coins, he would say, with a voice full of sorrow, "This was my father's final wish. I have not been given his money, but I must see his will done." With this single act of populist theater, his approval rating among the common people skyrocketed. He was the good son, the faithful heir, and Antony was transformed into the villain. A man who respected neither Caesar's legacy nor the plight of the poor. Having executed this masterstroke, the good boy Octavian did not wait for Antony to retaliate. He liquidated his remaining assets in Rome, gathered his newfound loyalists, and took the money south. To what end? To raise an army, his own private army. This was, we must state, profoundly illegal under Roman law, but Octavian held two trump cards. First, he was Caesar's legitimate heir. Second, Antony had lost credibility. Antony had promised the Senate he would not pursue the assassins, then turned around and used the mob to drive them out of town. He was seen as treacherous. And so, when Octavian began to display his political acumen, many of those same powerful senators he had flattered, the very men who had killed his father, began to support him in secret. They turned a blind eye to his illegal recruitment, when an enraged Antony, in his capacity as consul, declared Octavian an enemy of the state. The motion was vetoed by a tribune of the plebs. Enemy of the state, the argument went. Young Octavian, why, he's a good boy. Faced with this, Antony was stymied. He could not simply march an army against Octavian. The people of Rome would have torn him apart. As it happened, a distraction presented itself, one of Caesar's assassins. A man named Decimus had raised a rebel army in southern Gaul. Antony, ever the soldier, craving military glory and underestimating the boy in the south, made a decision. He would shelve the Octavian problem for now. He donned his armor and marched north to crush the rebellion. It proved to be his single greatest blunder. The moment Antony was gone, Octavian seized the opportunity without a moment's hesitation. He marched his new army back to Rome and extended a hand of friendship to the very men who had murdered his adoptive father. The Republican senators, united by their mutual hatred of Antony's betrayal and charmed by Octavian's silver tongue, they threw their support behind the young man. Chief among them was Cicero. Cicero, the most learned man in Rome, its greatest writer and thinker, was utterly bewitched by Octavian. He delivered a series of 14 blistering speeches. The Philippics, in which he relentlessly vilified Antony and praised Octavian as a hero of the people, the savior of the Republic. And so it was that Octavian, at the age of 19, was granted a seat in the Senate. Was this illegal? Of course. But was raising a private army legal? Of course not. Once one has crossed the Rubicon of illegality, what is one more transgression? And so, in the world of politics, Octavian now sat as an equal among men 3 times his age. Then, under the combined influence of Octavian and Cicero, the Senate performed a stunning reversal. They declared that their comrade Antony was a comrade no longer. He was a traitor, a charlatan, a rogue, in short, an enemy of Rome. And they commissioned Octavian, along with 2 newly elected consuls, to lead a Roman army to hunt him down, with Decimus in front of him and the Senate's army at his back. Antony was quickly overwhelmed. He was defeated and fled into the Alps. But here, a strange thing happened. The Roman army, which had won an easy victory with no major battles, suffered a catastrophic loss of leadership. The 2 new consuls, the men in command, both died. How very convenient, with the army suddenly leaderless. The 3rd in command, our young Octavian, stepped forward. He addressed the troops. "If you make me your leader," he declared, "I will see to it that your wages are increased by several multiples." The soldiers, most of them Caesar's old veterans, did the calculus. Here before them stood Caesar's own son. He was promising them a vast sum of money. Why would they not follow him? And just like that, after a dazzling series of performances, Octavian had not only driven Antony into exile, but had also absorbed all of Caesar's former legions in the north. And if you were to ask how those 2 consuls met their untimely end, that is a matter on which the histories are curiously silent. We shall say no more. What followed was simple. It was a play taken directly from his father's book. Octavian led his 8 legions, more than 50,000 men, across the Rubicon River and returned to Rome. The Senate could do nothing but pinch its nose and accept the inevitable. At Octavian's suggestion, they held a public election and named him to the highest office in the Republic. Consul, he was, as we have said, 19 years old. To hold such an office at such an age was, in the entire history of Rome, without precedent. A singular achievement. Just then, however, the board changed once more. Brutus, who had fled to the east, was rapidly expanding his power in Syria and Macedonia. He had amassed an army of over 100,000 men and a large fleet. He was preparing to march back to Rome. Octavian immediately made the correct and ruthless calculation. Brutus, the son of Caesar's former mistress, and he, Caesar's adopted son, were locked in a blood feud. It was a rivalry unto death, but Antony, hiding in the Alps to the north, that was a mere internal dispute. Both men, after all, were of Caesar's faction. Based on this understanding, Octavian dispatched envoys to Antony. At the same time, he reached out to another of Caesar's former lieutenants, the master of the horse, Lepidus. In November of 43 BCE, the Roman political stage saw yet another shocking reversal. Octavian and Antony, who days before had been mortal enemies, shook hands. They, along with Lepidus, formed a formal military alliance. History knows it as the Second Triumvirate, and to seal the deal with Antony, young Octavian took the rather proactive step of marrying Antony's stepdaughter and began to address his former rival as father-in-law. There is a crucial detail to note about this Second Triumvirate. It was an officially recognized body. The Senate knew it was a profoundly dangerous arrangement for them, yet they were powerless to refuse. They once again pinched their noses and formally declared the Triumvirate to be the supreme military authority of Rome. With a term of 5 years, the reason they could not refuse was simple. The Triumvirate controlled the legions. The old men of the Senate simply did not have the muscle to argue. And here, a brief, grim aside on the state of Roman society. The average life expectancy in Rome at this time was roughly 20 years, even if one discounts infant mortality. It rises only to 29, yet the average age of a man in the Senate was 70. This single statistic tells you everything you need to know about Rome. It was a society not only of vast economic disparity, but of a fundamental inequality in the right to life itself. One might, hearing this, feel a certain relief to be living in our own time, where at least the right to life is held to be more or less equal, and that is a fair thought. But if you believe this is merely the result of enlightened political philosophy, allow me to propose a hypothetical. Imagine for a moment that a genetic modification technique were invented today, an expensive, complex procedure that could allow a person to live free of disease to the age of 150. When such a technology cannot be made universal, who do you suppose gets it first? I suspect it would not be me. But let us return to our narrative. One might assume that the senators, having been so thoroughly humbled, would at least be allowed to live out their days in quiet, secure retirement. One would be entirely wrong. The Triumvirate, to prevent any collusion between the senators in Rome and Brutus's republicans in the east, turned on the Senate with cold fury. They raised the sword of prescription. Over 300 senators and 2,000 knights were executed. Their property was confiscated. The Senate was suddenly half empty. These newly vacant positions and the immense wealth that came with them were neatly divided among Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. The most famous victim of this purge was our great philosopher and man of letters, Cicero, for his tireless, eloquent, and daily opposition to Antony. Cicero was hunted down by Antony's assassins. They cut off his head, and Antony, his rage still not sated, had Cicero's skull fashioned into a large wine goblet, which he used for a considerable time. When the novelty wore off, he simply tossed it away. Where it landed, no one knows, and Octavian, he watched the entire spectacle unfold. He offered no protest. He made no move to repay the old man for the lavish praise he had heaped upon him just 1 year prior. Indeed, he may well have been pleased. A writer of Cicero's power, left alive, would have been a threat to him as well. In the year 42 BCE, their coffers full and their internal enemies eliminated, Antony and Octavian marched their armies to face Brutus and his allies. The war that followed was rich with drama and tragic irony. First, Antony defeated the forces of Cassius, the man who had been the first to plunge his dagger into Caesar. But on another part of the field, Octavian was defeated by Brutus. This was not surprising. Octavian had no real experience of war. His battlefield was the political arena. But then, a strange and fateful event occurred. Cassius, defeated by Antony, received a piece of battlefield intelligence that was completely false. The report he received stated that Brutus, too, had been defeated by Octavian. Despairing, believing all was lost, Cassius drew his own sword and took his life. This, of course, left Brutus to face the combined forces of Antony and Octavian entirely alone. Surrounded and overwhelmed, with no hope of victory, he too fell upon his sword. One cannot, in this case, blame society. Cassius and Brutus, that hapless pair, were destroyed not by a superior force, but by a catastrophic failure of the information supply chain. After this conflict, known to posterity as the Battle of Philippi, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus divided the Roman world, not by cutting up a map, of course, but by carving out spheres of influence. Lepidus took North Africa. Octavian held Italy and the western provinces. The rest, Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, all the wealthy eastern provinces, went to Antony. It is clear that Antony received the largest slice of the pie. This was to be expected. He was the proven military commander. His strength was undeniable. For a time, an uneasy peace settled over Rome. The three titans were busy managing their own domains. When the son of Pompey the Great launched a rebellion, blockading Rome's grain supply, Antony and Lepidus even helped Octavian put it down. This begs a question. Why did Antony, at the height of his power, not simply eliminate the younger, weaker Octavian? There are two primary reasons. First, Octavian was a consummate actor. He deployed a dizzying array of political maneuvers that left the less subtle Antony utterly confused. Most notably, he married his own sister, the noble Octavia. To Antony, a gesture that convinced the older man of his sincere desire for alliance. We shall not dwell on the fact that Octavian had previously been Antony's son-in-law. For a father-in-law to become a brother-in-law was a perfectly normal affair in European history. We might, however, have reminded Antony that Pompey and Caesar once shared a similarly complex web of marital ties. And Pompey ended up dead at Caesar's behest. When Caesar's hand-picked heir sends his own sister to your bed, you might accept the gesture, but a certain measure of caution is surely warranted. Alas, this is a warning our friend Antony could no longer hear. The second reason Antony held back was that he had his own grand design. The man intended to march east and conquer the Parthian Empire. If he could achieve this, then no matter how well Octavian managed Italy, he would ultimately be forced to bow before Antony's supreme power. To achieve this grand ambition, he needed Octavian's support. He needed soldiers. He needed supplies. He could not afford a war in the West. Now, concerning this Parthian Empire, they were, like the Persians, a branch of the Iranian peoples. They had supplanted the Seleucid kingdom of Alexander the Great's successors and had dominated Central Asia for a very long time. It was Crassus, of the first triumvirate, who had died trying to conquer them. It was Caesar himself who was preparing to march against them when he was so rudely interrupted by a mob of senators with daggers. Rome and Parthia were, in short, mortal enemies. Their border, roughly the Euphrates River, was a constant flashpoint. Whenever one side showed the slightest sign of weakness, the other would invariably invade, hoping to seize some small advantage. And so, while Rome was consumed by its civil wars, it was only natural that Parthia would make a move. In that same year, 42 BCE, while Antony and Octavian were busy with Brutus, Parthia attacked Rome's client state in southern Syria, the province of Judea. Today, when one speaks of the Jewish people, one does so with a certain reverence for their long and profoundly influential history. Historically ancient is certainly correct. Profoundly influential, however, depends rather heavily on which era one is discussing. In the age when Rome bestrode the world, the influence of the Jews was, to be frank, negligible. One could say that were it not for the emergence, from their ranks, of a certain figure of world historical importance, we might almost ignore them entirely. But as it stands, history unfolded as it did, and so, as they now intersect with the story of Mark Antony, we must pause our Roman chronicle. This detour is essential to understanding the world these Romans sought to conquer. We shall turn our gaze to this Jewish nation and to their legendary past. Long, long ago, the land we now call Palestine was inhabited by a people known as the Canaanites. They were the natives, but some 3,500 years ago, a nomadic tribe from the Arabian desert wandered into these lands. They fell upon the Canaanites, subdued them, and announced that this land was now their home. It was the conquered Canaanites who gave the invaders their name. They called them the Hebrews, which simply means the people from across the river. The river in question is the Euphrates, and so, if one adheres to strict historical evidence, the precise origin of the Hebrew people remains a matter of scholarly debate. I use the qualifier strict for a reason, because if one is willing to be less strict, the Hebrews have an origin story, and it is not merely an origin story, it is a magnificent, divinely sanctioned epic, a century or so after their arrival. Around 1223 BCE, they were defeated by Egypt. The great pharaoh Merneptah inscribed upon a stele the famous words, "Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not." This is the first known historical appearance of the word Israel. Why this name? The scholarly consensus is that the Hebrew peoples had already divided. Those in the north called themselves the Kingdom of Israel, those in the south, the Kingdom of Judah. To the invading Egyptians, they were all one people. But what, you might ask, of the Jews? The answer is simple. The Hebrews of the southern kingdom of Judah are the Jews. Now, let us return to the narrative. The Egyptian invasion did not destroy the Hebrews. It was not until 722 BCE that the northern kingdom of Israel was finally destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom of Judah became a vassal state. Then, in 586 BCE, a new power, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, under its king, Nebuchadnezzar II, conquered Judah. The capital, Jerusalem, was sacked, and tens of thousands of Hebrews were taken back to Babylon as captives. This event is known to history as the Babylonian captivity. And yet, these captives would accomplish something that would profoundly alter the course of human history. In 538 BCE, the rising Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians. The Persian Emperor, Cyrus the Great, needed a buffer zone in Syria, and so, after 50 years of captivity, the prisoners of Babylon, the Jews, were allowed to return to the land of Canaan. But their return did not end their suffering. The fact remained that they were desperately weak, a people caught in the crossfire of empires, in one 17-year period alone. Control of Jerusalem changed hands 7 times. Though their bodies were constantly subjugated, their spirit grew immensely powerful. Why? This brings us back to our unanswered question. What great deed did the captives of Babylon accomplish during their 50 years of exile? Simply put, they wrote a book, if one were to judge by circulation. No other book in history could dare claim to be its rival. Its name is the Old Testament, though for a devout Jew, the proper name is the Tanakh. In this book, the Jewish people crafted their history into a seamless, perfect narrative. So what does this great book say? It begins, as all great stories should, at the beginning. It tells of a God who creates the world, and the first man and woman, Adam and Eve. It tells of their expulsion from a paradise, a great flood that cleansed the world, and the survival of a single righteous man, Noah. The book says that the Hebrews are the direct descendants of Noah's first and favored son, Shem. They are, in this telling, the chosen people of a chosen patriarch. But why did this give them the right to the land of Canaan? The book, of course, has an answer. A story is told of how Shem's descendants were divinely granted the land of Canaan by God himself as a reward for their piety. It is the promised land. And the people of Canaan, descended from a less favored son, were destined to be their servants. Thus, the conquest was not conquest, it was destiny, it was divinely ordained. This is the root of the millennia-long, unshakable connection the Jewish people have to this land. The book recounts the heroic deeds of the Jewish patriarchs. Of Jacob, who wrestled with an angel and was given the name Israel, meaning one who strives with God. Of Moses, who led his people out of bondage in Egypt. Of King David and King Solomon. Are these stories true? Perhaps not literally. They are likely the semi-mythical legends of tribal chieftains, magnified over centuries, much like the tales of Rome's own Romulus. But what makes the work of the Babylonian captives so revolutionary is not the crafting of a national epic. It is that within this book, they forged a unique form of worship. A belief in a Messiah. This belief gave the Jewish people the conviction that their generations of suffering were a trial, in anticipation of a day when a Savior would come to redeem them. Crucially, this belief held that the Messiah was coming to save only the Jewish people. This faith became known as Judaism, and so, having forged this unshakable identity in the crucible of exile, these people would face a new master, a master from the West. After the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Greeks, it was finally Rome's turn. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey the Great marched into Judea and turned it into a Roman client state. At the time, a minor official in the Jewish court named Antipater transferred his loyalty to his new Roman masters. In 48 BCE, his loyalty paid off. After aiding Julius Caesar in Egypt, Caesar declared Antipater the highest authority in Judea and appointed his younger son, Herod, as a governor. This brings us at last back to our main stage, back to the year 42 BCE. While Antony and Octavian were fighting Brutus, the Parthian Empire invaded Judea. Their victory was aided by many Jews who despised Antipater's family. They killed Antipater, and only his son Herod escaped. He fled to Rome to plead for aid. By then, Antony and Octavian had won their war and were carving up the world. Both men had a fondness for Herod. They waved aside his modest proposals and, with the full authority of Rome, officially enthroned him as the King of the Jews, the first historically verifiable king of the Jews, who was, ironically, not a Jew. Herod, with Roman backing, immediately launched a counterattack. In 38 BCE, with the help of Antony's legions, he retook Jerusalem. The Roman soldiers began to slaughter the city's inhabitants, and Herod was forced to bribe them, begging, "My lords, I pray you, leave some of them alive. These are now my subjects. If you kill them all, who will I be king of?" Having retaken Judea, Antony was not satisfied. His ambition now burned hotter than ever. He would conquer Parthia. In 36 BCE, Antony led an army of over 100,000 men and marched east. His grand expedition ended in failure. Why? The defeat perfectly illustrates the difference between a great general and a great commander-in-chief. A general wins battles. A commander-in-chief wins wars. He must see the entire board, coordinating disparate forces across a vast theater. Antony was a peerless general, as Caesar's second-in-command. He had been flawless, but now, with 100,000 men under his sole command, he was simply out of his depth, and yet his brilliance as a general shone through even in defeat. He retreated back to Syria, having lost 30,000 men, but he had also inflicted heavy losses on the Parthians. From a strategic perspective, it was a total failure. But from a tactical one, he had fought with honor. Despite returning in disgrace, Antony was not discouraged. 2 years later, he led another expedition and won a decisive victory. By all rights, he should have returned to Rome to celebrate a magnificent triumph. It was a necessary move in his political war against Octavian, but he did not. He held his triumph in Alexandria, the capital of Egypt. The primary reason was a woman, Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt. The woman who had once captivated Caesar had now utterly conquered Antony. She needed his power, and he craved not only her beauty, but the immense wealth of her kingdom. It was a partnership of perfect, mutual convenience. The other reason Antony shunned Rome was that he had decided to abandon all pretense. He was ready for an open break with Octavian. He began appointing his own sons as kings of Rome's eastern territories. He named Cleopatra Queen of Kings. And most provocatively of all, he declared that Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was Caesar's true and most legitimate heir. This was a direct assault on Octavian's entire identity. It was calling him a usurper to his face. Octavian, of course, could not tolerate this, but whether one can afford to be intolerant is not a matter of temperament. It is a matter of power, and by now, Octavian's power had grown immensely. He had absorbed the territories of Lepidus, the third man in the triumvirate. 3 years prior, Lepidus, puffed up with pride, had overplayed his hand. He threatened the Senate, but he did not realize his own legions had already been bought by Octavian. The day after he issued his threats, he awoke to find his army had deserted him. Lepidus was stripped of all titles and forced into retirement, and so, in the year 36 BCE, Rome's three-headed beast became a two-headed one. The 27-year-old Octavian now controlled the entire western half of the Roman world. He was ready for the final contest. In 32 BCE, the gloves came off. Antony denounced Octavian as a low-born upstart who had faked Caesar's will. This was a foolish attack, given that it was Antony himself who had first read that will to the Roman people. Octavian's response was far more cunning. He aimed his propaganda not at Antony, but at Cleopatra. Our Antony, he argued, was a good Roman boy. He has been corrupted by the seductive wiles of an Eastern witch. An Egyptian woman now presumes to rule over Roman lands. Therefore, he declared, Rome must go to war against Egypt. The genius of this move was that it transformed a civil war into a foreign one. The people of Rome, whipped into a patriotic fury against Cleopatra, naturally lost all sympathy for Antony. How dare he use the lands we bled for as a currency to woo his foreign mistress? And Antony could not possibly abandon Egypt. It was his base of power, and besides, his love for Cleopatra appears to have been genuine. Unlike Caesar, who used her, Antony adored her. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, the final, decisive battle was fought at sea, off the coast of Actium. Antony's fleet met the fleet commanded by Octavian's brilliant admiral, Agrippa. The battle was evenly matched until the reserve fleet, commanded by Cleopatra herself, suddenly broke formation and fled. Antony, seeing his love retreat, was thrown into a panic. Without a thought for his fleet, for his men, for the war itself, he abandoned the battle and gave chase. It was an act of tactical suicide. His fleet was annihilated. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. In August of the year 30 BCE, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony, his spirit broken, heard a rumor that Cleopatra was dead. In his despair, he fell upon his sword. As he lay dying, a messenger arrived. My lord, we were mistaken. The queen is not dead. The dying Antony had his men hoist him up to her tomb, where he died in the arms of his lover. As for Cleopatra, her end is the stuff of legend. The historian Plutarch tells us that she was captured by Octavian, who intended to parade her through Rome. Learning of this, Cleopatra had a servant smuggle in a poisonous asp, and so ended her own legendary life. It is a dramatic tale. But a more plausible theory is that Octavian simply had her poisoned. He could not permit anyone who might threaten his rule to live. This ruthless logic explains what happened next. He took Antony and Cleopatra's children and had them raised by his own sister, a gesture of mercy, but for Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, there was no mercy. He had the boy executed without hesitation. Caesarion, as Caesar's only biological son, was the one rival he could not afford to let live. And so, at this point, Octavian had no enemies left in the entire Roman world, but this was a height others had reached before. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, his own adoptive father, Caesar, and what became of them? Not one had a happy end. Their reforms were dismantled, their names dragged through the mud. This was not the future Octavian envisioned for himself. He intended not only to hold supreme power, but to be worshipped as a god after his death, and to ensure his policies endured for generations. How could this be achieved? All the world's a stage, and we are merely players. A great performance requires two things: a brilliant script and a transcendent actor. Many a promising player has been undone by a flawed second act, but Octavian was a genius of an actor, and the script he wrote for the rest of his life was a masterpiece. Upon his return to Rome, his first act was to formally renounce the position of dictator. He understood the secret of power. It lies not in the title, but in the reality of force. The title dictator inspired only fear and hatred. It was why his father had been killed, and so he began his performance. He had his loyal subordinate, Agrippa, elected as his co-consul. For 5 years, they governed together, subtly and legally purging the Senate of any who opposed them. One by one, uncooperative senators were brought up on charges of corruption and removed from power. It was a slow, methodical boiling of the frog. Then, on the 16th of January, in the year 27 BCE, a day of monumental importance for Western history, Octavian, having secured total control, resigned his consulship. It was the masterstroke of his performance. In response to this noble gesture, the grateful Senate, prompted by Octavian's own agents, bestowed upon him a new title. Augustus, the name meant revered one, the majestic. At the time, it was merely an honorific. Then Octavian made a humble request, now that he was no longer consul. He asked if he might be granted the governorship of a few of the frontier provinces, Spain, Gaul, Syria. This was a normal procedure, except that he was asking for the most troublesome ones. The Senate agreed unanimously and with genuine enthusiasm, for 3 reasons. First, they were impressed by his seeming humility. Second, they were already under his thumb. And third, they thought they were getting the better end of the deal. You see, these frontier provinces were where Rome's great armies were stationed. Garrisoning armies was fantastically expensive. Governing them meant constant warfare. It meant risking death. No sane aristocrat wanted these thankless, perilous jobs. They wanted the rich, peaceful provinces. And now, here was Augustus, volunteering to take the difficult provinces off their hands, leaving all the wealthy, comfortable territories for them. He gave them wealth, he gave them prestige, he gave them the illusion of power, and in return, he took only a hollow-sounding title and a collection of the most unprofitable, war-torn scraps of the empire. He looked, for all the world, like a fool. The question that remained was this: what would this fool do next? And how would he use these useless provinces to transform himself into Rome's first and greatest emperor?